Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today, as we celebrate Christmas, I'd like to reflect with you on Matthew's story of the Epiphany. This is a project of beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other podcasts and Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus and practicing nonviolence and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. So, dear friends, let's begin with a little prayer. I invite you to, wherever you are, just take a deep breath and just to relax and recenter yourselves. And together, let's enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely, personally, and everyone everywhere. And we welcome the risen nonviolent Jesus here with us and ask for whatever Christmas graces we need to follow Jesus more faithfully and do God's will. God of peace, thank you for all the Christmas blessings of life, love, and peace that you give us as we celebrate the birth and life of the nonviolent Jesus. Be with us as we reflect on the story of the Epiphany. Help us that we might recognize the presence of the nonviolent Jesus in our midst, that we too might renounce the culture of violence and war and give our lives to him and to the coming of your reign of peace on earth. Bless us that we might deepen in peace, hope, nonviolence, and discipleship, that we might be renewed and strengthened to do your will, to seek your reign, to do our part to help end hatred, racism, violence, poverty, fascism and war, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction, to welcome your Christmas gift of peace on earth. Amen. Well, Merry Christmas, everyone. I thought that we might, as a way to celebrate Christmas, reflect together on Matthew's story of the Magi. So when we look at the whole world today, with all its violence, injustice, war, and empire, and ponder that the incarnation of the God of peace takes place in such a world, in all this insane killing and violence and poverty and nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, I think we see not the coming of the God of peace, but an anti-Advent, an anti-Christmas, the coming of the anti-reign of violence and war. And it's into that world of total violence, this Christmas, we celebrate the birth of the greatest person of nonviolence and peace in history. So Christmas is a time to deepen our own commitment to active, creative, loving nonviolence, and renew ourselves to be better peacemakers in the new year and more faithful disciples of the nonviolent Jesus. So 2,000 years ago, Joseph and Mary lived also in a horrific time during a brutal empire. They were totally poor, homeless refugees. Jesus is born in extreme poverty. And then we get to Matthew's gospel, which begins with the genealogy of Jesus to tell us that, hey, here's the Messiah. He's a direct descendant of Abraham and David. Then we get a brief account of his birth. And then this single story of the Magi. Then just a few chapters later, we've got Jesus as the new lawgiver, the new Moses, giving us the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, and the new commandments of nonviolence and universal love. Now, what I'm going to pitch is that Matthew's story of the Epiphany in chapter 2 sums up the entire gospel in a nutshell. So I want to break the story down into 4 parts, if you're still with me. First, the journey to the nonviolent Jesus. Second, the epiphany of meeting the nonviolent Jesus. Third, what do we do after we meet the nonviolent Jesus? And fourth, which is the epilogue, how the empire, the culture of violence and war, reacts to the coming of the nonviolent Jesus and the threat of our active, daring nonviolence. If you'd like to read what I'm sharing, you can find it all at the beginning of my recent book, The Gospel of Peace, a commentary on Matthew, Mark, and Luke from the perspective of nonviolence. I think this is an original take. It's a political reading on the Epiphany. And so what I'm suggesting is that the story of the Magi, of the Epiphany, is our story. Like the three wisdom figures, we too are on a spiritual journey, a holy pilgrimage, one that lasts throughout our lives, and it's a journey to the nonviolent Jesus, to the God of peace. So I'm going to be asking a series of questions as I do this political reflection on the Matthew text. And I'm hoping they'll make this a kind of a little Christmas retreat for you. Where are you in the story, in these three movements? So we have the Magi, the three wise people, on a pilgrimage in search of the God of peace, the nonviolent Messiah. Then we have the second movement, meeting the nonviolent Jesus, having an epiphany of the God of peace. The third movement, they go forth now entirely focused on the God of peace and God's reign of peace, not the culture of war, violence, and empire, and its dominating, militaristic, sociopathic, narcissistic ruler. These three movements are followed by this epilogue. So my questions are, where are you in these three movements? Are you like the Magi on holy pilgrimage in search of the God of peace, the nonviolent Jesus? Are you encountering the God of peace and the nonviolent Jesus there on the margins, among the poor, among the homeless, the immigrants, the refugees? Or are you having an epiphany of the God of peace in your life these days? Or are you like the Magi, after the Epiphany encounter, committed to living forever in God's reign of universal love and peace, and therefore turning away from the culture of violence, war, and empire? So now I'm going to read the first part from Matthew chapter 2. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star at its rising and have come to do him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it has been written through the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, since from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." So then Herod called the Magi secretly and ascertained from them the time of the star's appearance. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I too may go and do him homage." After their audience with the king, they set out, and behold, the star that they had seen at its rising preceded them until it came and stopped over the place where the child was. So right from the get-go, Matthew says, when the nonviolent Jesus is born, the whole culture of violence and war reacts. Everyone is affected. On the one hand, the empire is already totally threatened by the nonviolent Jesus. On the other hand, all of creation, the universe itself, symbolized in the star, points to the nonviolent Jesus and says, "There's your hope. There's your peace. There's your way out." Three Magi wisdom figures set out to find the newborn king, and King Herod, the brutal tyrant and genocidal mass murderer who represents the Roman Empire, is greatly disturbed along with, quote, all of Jerusalem. That's very powerful. Think about it. This powerless child is already a threat to the most powerful war-making person in the region, in effect, the whole empire. So the tyrant gathers the authorities, including the religious authorities whom he keeps under his control, and asks for the birthplace of the Messiah, and they say Bethlehem, and he claims he wants to do homage. But like all imperial and government rulers, from then to today, he's a total liar. He's a mass murderer, so he doesn't care about lying. His intention is to kill the child, like all tyrants. He kills anyone who threatens their power, and he easily, nonchalantly, deliberately kills children, as all dictators and bullies and presidents do from then to today. So the three wise men are from the Persian priestly caste from the east, which is present-day Iraq and Iran. They're seekers, wisdom figures, and they're also, that means, Gentiles, non-Jews, put at the beginning of this gospel written for Jews converting to Christianity. The gospel never calls anybody wise. Never. So we conclude that they are wise because, why? They seek the nonviolent Jesus. And if we want to be wise, we too have to seek the nonviolent Jesus. So here at the start of the story, this is so amazing to me. We are learning from the get-go that the journey to the God of peace and the nonviolent Jesus has total political implications. Everyone everywhere is upset they are seeking this little child who's the new nonviolent Messiah. The wise men, therefore, in effect, if you look at it this way, they're disturbers of the peace. That is the false peace of the Pax Romana, like the Pax Americana, the culture of violence, empire, and war. They meet the horrible King Herod, who's all pious and spiritual and religious, and they're determined to go ahead on their journey to find the God of peace and see the star, so they follow the star, and that's all we have to do too. Like the holy Magi, we have to decide that no matter what anyone says to us, no matter what the culture says, no matter what the president or the media says, we're going to seek the nonviolent Jesus, the God of peace, come what may, and bet our lives on this nonviolent Messiah. Like the Magi, we're going to let creation lead us. Isn't that lovely? We become contemplatives who pay attention to nature, to the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains and sea and creatures, and let creation point us to the God of peace. It's that easy. If you look closely, creation is always leading us to the God of peace. This is the way the indigenous people by the millions have been living for thousands of years. They're much smarter and wiser than us. They are the Magi of today, letting creation point them to God. We have to learn to be like them. But don't be surprised if everyone gets upset at you if you keep talking about you're seeking this God of peace and the nonviolent Jesus. And then don't be surprised if creation leads you out of your comfort zone to a place you didn't expect, into the margins, among the powerless, the poor, the vulnerable, the victims, the children, the enemy. The Epiphany story insists that God is not found in the center of power, then or today, but in the margins, not among the rich and the powerful, but among the poorest of the poor and the powerless. If we open ourselves to creation, we will be led beyond the empire and the rich and powerful, out of our own littleness into a whole new world of hope and peace found on the margins, where we will experience the coming of the reign of God, peace on earth. So my questions for you are, how are you a wisdom figure on pilgrimage to the God of peace, to the nonviolent Jesus? How are you seeking the nonviolent Jesus today? How does nature point you to the God of peace? How has your journey to the God of peace led you into public contact with the ruling authorities to confront the culture of violence and war? How does your talk of peace and nonviolence and the God of peace and the nonviolent Jesus disturb others? In fact, the entire culture. I'm just thinking if I had time, I'd share so many stories. I never thought in my life I'd be brought before so many senators and Congress people and presidents, a queen, popes, political leaders, and presidents all around the world. Part 2. The second movement of the story is short and sweet. So I quote, "They were overjoyed at seeing the star, and on entering the house they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they prostrated themselves and did him homage. Then they opened their treasures and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh." It's beautiful. So we're told they are overjoyed at seeing the star. Creation points them to God, and that fills them with joy. There's our path, dear friends. They follow the bright star, and it leads them to our beloved Mary and the beloved child. And this is their epiphany, the great life-changing moment when they realize they're in the presence of the God of peace. So they fall down and do him homage and worship the God of peace. Now, I looked up the word epiphany in the dictionary, and it's, that sudden realization, self-actualization. But for our purposes, I define it as the sudden realization that you are in the presence of the God of peace. And that moment leads you to worship the God of peace. All our defenses and selfishness and ego falls away. And we fall humbly in love with this beautiful God. And it's so interesting. We're told they brought 3 gifts. Gold, which is what you give a king. Okay, I'm with you on that. Frankincense, which is what you give a high priest. Okay, beautiful, traditional for a Jewish king. And myrrh, which is what you use to anoint a dead body. What? Well, imagine how Mary feels about that. And the baby has been wrapped in swaddling clothes, which is what they're so poor. The only cloth they have is the material you use to wrap a dead body in. That's Jesus coming into the world. So I presume that somewhere along the way on our spiritual journey to the nonviolent Jesus, each one of us has had an epiphany moment when we realized we were in the presence of the God of peace, when nature points us to God, when our hearts are filled with joy and we're consoled, and when we worshiped God and presented our gifts. But I'd invite us to see life itself as an ongoing pilgrimage to the nonviolent Jesus, which is filled with epiphany moments when we are in the presence of the God of peace. This is what Merton taught. Sometimes I think if we open our hearts wide enough, we can have epiphany moments every single day. If we're really single-heartedly seeking to encounter the God of peace and meeting the nonviolent Jesus and worshiping the God of peace and adoring the God of peace and bringing all our finest gifts that would help and honor and serve the nonviolent Jesus. Certainly we can have epiphanies of the God of peace in our prayer, when we receive communion at Mass, when we serve Jesus and the poor and homeless, and if we go deep into the sacramental work for peace and justice and creation. So here are my questions for you. When did you have an epiphany of the God of peace? When have you met the nonviolent Jesus among the poor, the homeless, the marginalized? How does nature continue to lead you to the God of peace? How does creation, the star, bring you joy when you suddenly realize you're in the presence of the God of peace and fill you with consolation? And the old practice of St. Ignatius of Loyola is you return to those great epiphanies and moments of consolation for the rest of your life. You can dip back into them at any moment. How are you worshiping the God of peace? And maybe this is very helpful to ask. What gifts do you bring the nonviolent Jesus? Isn't that lovely? So, part 3 is just one sentence. Here we go. Having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their country by another way. The third movement of the Epiphany story is utterly shocking. This is the clincher, the surprise ending. Here's the teaching. Buckle your seatbelts. This is the whole point of what I wanted to share with you. Once you encounter the nonviolent Jesus, once you have an epiphany of the God of peace among the poor, you change the direction of your life. Like the 3 Magi, you go home a different way. Everything has changed, including your politics. We no longer do what the leaders of the culture of violence, empire, and war tell us. We have encountered the God of peace. So from now on, we no longer cooperate with the culture of war and empire or its war-making rulers who are always telling us what to do, from King Herod and Pilate to the Roman emperor to what? Reagan, Bush, Obama, Trump. From now on, our allegiance is solely to the nonviolent Jesus and the God of peace and God's reign. As people of wisdom, we are going to worship the nonviolent Jesus and do what he says. I find that very exciting and hopeful. So when the Magi refused to go back to Herod and turned home on a different route, think about it. They're committing nonviolent civil disobedience. They're disobeying the evil ruler. They could have been killed for this unlawful behavior. And their disobedience, we're told by Matthew, this is the beginning of the gospel, infuriates the evil King Herod and all the rulers who are always trying to maintain their imperial power and control and wage war and kill their rivals and snuff out every grassroots movement of justice, peace, and nonviolence. The nonviolent Jesus and his way of nonviolence, we are learning right here at the start of Matthew, are a total threat to the powers that be, to the empire, the culture of violence and war, the rulers, the war makers, the military, and the powerful religious leaders then and now, if you have eyes to see and if you're reading the gospel correctly. So the principalities and powers always try to turn us away from God, to lead us away from the God of peace and the power of nonviolence, because they understand nonviolence better than we do. Jesus says that later. They know that organized grassroots, bottom-up people power movements of nonviolence are more powerful than anything, including military forces, all the weapons of the world, and all empires, that we have power, people power, when we withdraw our consent from the rulers. So they always lie and seek to kill nonviolent leaders who emerge from the world of the poor, like Dr. King and the Kennedys and Romero and Gandhi, to crush any grassroots, bottom-up people power movements of nonviolence. I think Matthew is inviting us to seek the nonviolent Jesus on the margins of the culture of violence, empire, and war, and let our encounter with the nonviolent Jesus, our experience with the nonviolent Jesus and the God of peace, lead us away from the corrupt culture of violence and war to go in a different direction in the culture, in our case, America, to turn away from money, consumerism, greed, racism, gun violence, executions, warfare, fascism, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, from now on to live as wisdom pilgrims of nonviolence who obey Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is coming up shortly. So from now on, we're nonviolent resistors. Wow, that's what I get from the Epiphany story. So some questions. How has your encounter with the nonviolent Jesus, your encounter with the God of peace, your experience with gospel nonviolence changed the direction of your life and led you away from the culture of violence and war, from America, in opposition to our ruling authorities, Democrat and Republican, and the whole empire, towards God's reign of universal love, peace, and nonviolence? You know, for myself, my epiphanies have led me to a lifetime of civil disobedience and steadfast resistance. 85 arrests, over 400 courtroom appearances. I'm very used to handcuffs and police cars and jails and holding cells all over the country and all the disruptions that have come with that. And I count it all a great blessing and a joy, and I highly recommend it. Finally, we get to the long part 4, which I call the epilogue of the story, which is what happens after the epiphany of the Magi and their nonviolent resistance to Herod. So I'm going to read this. This is the end of the story from Matthew. So here we go. When they departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt and stay there until I tell you. Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." Joseph rose, note the resurrection language, and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. He stayed there until the death of Herod, that what the Lord had said through the prophet might be fulfilled. "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been deceived by the Magi, he became furious, and he ordered the massacre of all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had ascertained from the Magi. Then was fulfilled what had been said through Jeremiah the prophet. A voice was heard in Rabbah, sobbing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children, and she would not be consoled, since they were no more. Later, when Herod had died, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." And so he rose, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was now ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go back there. And because he'd been warned in a dream, he departed north for the region of Galilee. And he went and dwelt in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. So Matthew says here right at the start, Herod is furious to discover that the Magi deceived him. Now please note this word deceived. Wait, aren't these holy wisdom spiritual figures the greatest saints? And they're deceiving the political leader who has the power to kill them all? So again, the three wisdom figures disobeyed Herod and the empire. They refused to cooperate with him, and they went home a different way. How dare they? Dear friends, that's the spiritual life in a nutshell. That's the height of spiritual wisdom. To disobey our corrupt, greedy, genocidal, war-making, nuclear weapons threatening, environmentally destroying, criminal political leaders who are on the verge of destroying the whole planet, much less killing the children of the world and the poor. It's such an important lesson. Herod would have killed Jesus and his parents and any witnesses right there from the get-go. So he now issues an order to kill every boy in Bethlehem and the surrounding area 2 years and under. This, dear friends, is the Christmas story. Remember that Christmas is directly connected. It's a straight arrow to the cross. So here we see how empires and rulers use death as a social methodology, how they care nothing for human life, especially for children, and how they threaten humanity with death to maintain their control and power. And that means, we got to kill the children. And this is what we see everywhere today, if you have eyes to see. Don't be naive. These days, the nations are planning total nuclear destruction and allowing catastrophic climate change to destroy the planet and kill millions of holy innocents in the future. Dare I say, as the scientists say, maybe billions of holy innocents. The nonviolent Jesus has come to stop all this, and he's coming to ask for our help. So just as the Magi disobey the ruler of the culture of war in order to obey the God of peace, so all of us who seek the God of peace from now on disobey the rulers of the culture of violence and war and turn away from them and walk the new uncharted path of gospel nonviolence, where we don't know where it's going to go. But from now on, our allegiance is to the nonviolent Jesus, whom we've met, whom we know, and we happily accept all the social and political implications of that encounter. Once you meet the God of peace and nonviolence, your first act is to fall down and worship, and you're full of joy. Your second act is to disobey the false gods of violence and war and the imperial ruling authorities who kill and wage war all around the planet. So the real question then is, what does the slaughter of the holy innocents have to do with Christmas? Then or now? It shows us how we've totally co-opted Christmas. The empire's completely co-opted it. But how, in truth, how Christmas is totally real and authentic and political, in your face. If we understood who this child is and what he's going to do and what he's going to teach in the Sermon on the Mount and the grassroots, people power, bottom-up movement of total nonviolence, which he's going to start and which continues today. Today, our country and the countries of the world are continuing to kill holy innocents everywhere. You need only look at Gaza or South Sudan or Ukraine or the millions of starving children around the world. Our task, as people who claim to have had an epiphany of the God of peace, who have met the nonviolent Jesus, who want to live according to the Sermon on the Mount, nonviolence, to be people of universal love, is to non-cooperate with this culture of violence and war and the rulers who kill the innocents, to resist them nonviolently to the day we die, to defend the world's children nonviolently, and to stop the ongoing slaughter of the innocents. That's our mission, not just not to kill, but to stop the killing and make sure it never happens again. As an Epiphany people who have encountered and follow the nonviolent Jesus, we are no longer on the side of the murderous rulers or war makers. We all have got to learn that lesson. We are the Jeremiah people who hear the cry of Rachel, weeping for her children today in Gaza, Iraq, Afghanistan, South Sudan, throughout Africa, all of India, all of Latin America, all of Asia. Who? The mothers of homeless youth, the mothers of death row inmates, the mothers of the immigrants being arrested and shipped off by ICE, the mothers of all the school shooting victims. Like Jesus, we go forward in grassroots movements of justice, disarmament, and nonviolence to stop the ongoing slaughter of the innocents. This is our job description, which we get at Christmas. It's a great blessing because it brings great joy. So my questions. What are the political consequences of your epiphanies of the God of peace? How are you ignoring them or denying them? What about embracing them? How does the empire and its rulers respond to the coming of the nonviolent Jesus today and the grassroots movement of organized, loving, active nonviolence? Where do you hear the cry of Rachel? Where do you see the slaughter of the innocents? How are you working to stop the slaughter of the innocents? How is the empire trying to stop us from following the nonviolent Jesus and living out, as the three wise figures do, the encounter, the epiphany encounter with the God of peace? Here are my conclusions of the epiphany story. First, is to say it again. God does not come to the rich and powerful, but to the poor and powerless. This is as true today as it was then. If you want to meet God, you got to go to the poor and powerless. Get out of your comfort zones. And that leads me to number two. Second, God is not found in the center of the culture of violence and war, but on its margins. This is the fundamental mistake of Christian history. I mean, it's so obvious right there in Matthew. We presume that God dwells at the center. Why wouldn't God be with the rich and famous and powerful and beautiful? No. I mean, Mother Teresa gave her whole life to that teaching. God, her famous quote, I heard her say it many times, God comes to us in the distressing disguise of the poor. God is on the margins with those no one wants to be with. Third, God is born among homeless people, refugees, migrants, the undocumented, immigrants, prisoners, those with no country, with no security, with no money, with no future, no hope. Also, God is born in nature. God is found in nature. Therefore, nature, all of creation, is pointing to God. With the story of the Magi, we know that God is for all of creation and for all people, for everyone, everywhere, and everyone is included. This brings me to another point I'm trying to say. Remember, Matthew's gospel, which is aimed at Jewish Christians, is declaring right at the start that Jesus is not just for the chosen people, but for Gentiles, and therefore all people. The Magi are Gentiles. This is scandalous. And they are the ones who seek out and receive the Holy Child and bring gold to Mary. You know, it's a spectacular story. Here's another point. Epiphanies happen at night. Think on that. They are journeys toward God, but they take place in the dark, in the unknown. The sudden spiritual experience of God's presence comes after a long journey at night. And so epiphanies require following stars, attending to creation, which means risking appearing foolish in the eyes of the world. You know, when I think about that, one of my favorite quotes of Dr. King is, and I hadn't put this in my text, but here goes. He said over and over again, only at night can you see the stars. Only in the dark. In other words, only when there's no hope, when you're in the dark, can you see the light of heaven. In other words, we have to become contemplatives if we want to have an epiphany. This is another critical lesson. Epiphanies require community. This is really important. Matthew does not tell this story about an individual wise figure. There's a community. And I think the lesson there from the beginning, especially toward us privileged Americans, is to give up our radical individualism, which has nothing to do with the gospel, and join a local community of peacemakers for the nonviolent Jesus. And the first thing Jesus does is form a community. The Magi seek the Holy Child together as a community. They worship the Holy Child together as a community, and they disobey and resist the war-making ruler and government together as a community. And to state the obvious again, epiphanies are always political. They become acts of nonviolent resistance to empire and war-making. They lead us to the God of peace, and the experience of God always, always, always leads us away from the war-making rulers. Why? Because we met God, and we know that God is universal peace, total nonviolence, universal love. That's why I think, dear friends, if this is the beginning of Matthew, and it sums up Matthew, epiphanies are life and death journeys. They involve risk. And that's what the gospel is all about. The days of normalcy and sitting in our comfort zones, those are over. Epiphanies require dropping everything we have planned immediately to go after the holy. Okay, so they're a little scary. They take us into the unknown. But what's not to like? We have friends. We have community. Didn't we just agree that? And we're going to encounter the holy, which might seem risky and scary, into this unknown place on the margins. No matter. We're full of joy because we've not only seen creation, we've seen and experienced the nonviolent Jesus, the God of peace. Well, then epiphanies are going to get us in trouble. How could they not? In a world of total war, if we're going to experience the God of total peace. They're going to disrupt our lives. And why do we go just so far toward God and then we stop? We get so afraid. Epiphanies call us out of our fear, and say, it doesn't matter. You've met the nonviolent Jesus. Let's keep following him. Yeah, so our lives get disrupted, but we're full of joy and consolation. And everything's going to be okay. And we can maintain that joy. That's what I experienced with my great friends, Daniel Berrigan, Desmond Tutu, and Thich Nhat Hanh, people of great joy. Epiphanies call us to the fullness of religious tolerance, which is what Gandhi insisted on. Mary and Joseph are Jews, and they welcome the Magi, non-Jews. So like Mary and Joseph, we respect all religions and all cultures. Let me emphasize again in the end, epiphanies of God fill us with joy and lead us to worship and offer gifts to God. When we meet God, we are filled with joy, and after that we resist all that is not of God, all that is not of God's reign. And friends, we let the chips fall where they may. That's the spiritual journey. That's the meaning of life, to seek our God, to experience our God, to risk prayer and worship and bringing gifts to God, to look for the nonviolent Jesus, meet him, and from now on, do what he says because we've become his faithful disciples. And so, come what may, we go forward on our pilgrimage. I read Matthew's story of the Epiphany as a metaphor for our pilgrimage through life to the nonviolent Jesus. Matthew's infancy narrative and Epiphany really sums up the gospel. So here's my concluding questions for you. Where are you again in the Epiphany story? How are you seeking the nonviolent Jesus? How is creation today, even in this time of climate change more than ever, pointing us to God? When and where have you encountered the nonviolent Jesus? What gifts are you bringing the nonviolent Jesus this Christmas? How has your encounter with the nonviolent Jesus, your epiphany, disarmed you and changed your life and set you on a different direction in total opposition to all the violent rulers of the world, all their militaries and weapons and all of the forces of death? How do we disobey the political war-making authorities and do our part to stop the ongoing slaughter of the innocents today and to console Rachel as she weeps for her children today? Dear friends, my hope and prayer has been that this political reflection of Christmas encourages you on your epiphany journey to the God of peace, to see where you are, to meet the nonviolent Jesus on the margins, and for the rest of your life, to carry on your nonviolent resistance to empire and stop the slaughter of the innocents. Thank you for listening to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. You can hear many more podcasts and find other upcoming Zoom programs at beatitudecenter.org. Please consider offering a donation to support this free work. And if you can, please leave some positive feedback or a review and tell your friends about this. Dear friends, may the God of peace bless us all. Keep on following the nonviolent Jesus, and a very Merry Christmas.